Everything that there is to be said about Patek's new Cubitus release has been said. And I don't want to beat a dead horse here. I want to provide solutions, not just criticism. There are watches out there, and I'm going to show you one today, around $40,000. Same price as that new Patek release, that are infinitely more interesting and beautiful and thought-provoking. So I'm going to show you that watch and two others, really incredible pieces from Rolex in today's episode, and they're all from Chrono 24. Today's episode is sponsored by our friends over at Miracle Sheets. More on them later. And today's episode, again, is something that I've toyed with doing in the past, where we go on the internet, take a look at the market, and find pieces, in this instance from Chrono 24. That's not the only place to buy watches. It's not my favorite place to buy watches for many reasons, and I can talk about that separately, but it is a good place to look at watches. That's for sure. It's definitely a good museum of unsold watches, if you will. So today's episode, we're going to leverage that museum, that database, and use it as a reference point, as a catalyst for conversation, a resource for photos and history. So today's first watch of the three that we'll talk about is Patek Philippe, the impetus for the entire conversation. Just the other day when Patek released the Cubitus, the whole idea was, delivering a piece essentially to the masses. Everyone should be able to own a Patek Philippe, whatever the heck that may mean. And they wanted to release a piece, at least in their original messaging, that was more, democratic at the $40,000 mark. We can talk about how we feel about that separately. We released a whole video actually about it just a couple of weeks ago. Go take a look at it. Link is down below. But this is going to be, again, more solution-oriented. There's a piece, there are many pieces out there, by the way, that actually represent exactly what Patek was trying to fill, that hole in the market, right? On the really approachable end, there's a multitude of different vintage watches, predominantly dress watches, or almost exclusively dress watches, really. In the Calatrava world, of varying levels of condition, but you can get a great Patek Philippe, sub $15,000, and here are photos of them. But I didn't want to even bring those into the conversation. I didn't want to make those the focus of today's conversation, because that's not even fair, right? That's bringing a gun to a knife fight, because the value that those watches bring is, they're so remarkable, and they are dress watches. So even as a matter of genre, it's not really fair. We should keep this conversation within the realm of, essentially modern-ish sports watches, okay? Specifically, in the Nautilus category. Does that exist? Does an approachable Nautilus exist? Well, of course, that is a relative term, and in the world of watches, ladies, I think, are far luckier than men. You can comb through, dozens and dozens and dozens of ladies' nautili of different variations of dial, of metal, of condition, of price point, of movement sort, and all these different things from the 80s and 90s, specifically well into the 2000s as well, but the 80s and 90s were such an amazing time for ladies' nautili. For ladies' nautili, as well as Royal Oaks. By the way, if you're looking to get your wife a watch, or your girlfriend, or whatever, your mother a watch, the value you can get in the world of women's watches, luxury women's watches, is amazing, right? Men get the short end of the stick on this one, right? But there is a reference that was introduced in 1982. But there is a reference, Patek Philippe Nautilus, that was introduced in 1981. It was the second generation of the Nautilus collection, the first being the reference 3700, the original Gerald Genta Nautilus, the jumbo, right, the original Nautilus. But then in 81, Patek Philippe released another one, the reference 3800, the reference we'll be talking about today. Well, people don't really understand about the 3800 because they're looking at the 3800 from, or through the lens of kind of modern opinion, right, where the 3800 doesn't really hold much of a candle to the 3700, right, its predecessor, the original, the 42 millimeter jumbo, as opposed to this 37 millimeter small Nautilus, right? Zooming back, like actually going back into history and taking a more accurate historical understanding or lens, this was the desirable Nautilus. This was the Nautilus that Patek Philippe released just a couple of years after the original, because Patek Philippe essentially said, Genta was on to something. There's something beautiful here. But the size wasn't right. The size maybe was right as a piece of art, but as a piece of marketable product, he was wrong. Let's let's change it a little bit. Let's be respectful to the design. Let's not change much, but let's change it just enough where you're essentially, finding the middle ground between art and business, right? Which really is the sweet spot that all brands essentially, or all self-respecting brands, all high-quality brands look for. It can't just be art for art's sake. There needs to be some level of some level of compromise and understanding of the consumer sensitivities and desires if they want a level of commercial success. Keep in mind, Patek Philippe is, while they don't make that many watches, they're still not a micro brand looking for 12 watches or to sell 12 watches a year, right? They're still selling thousands of watches. This is a prominent global brand. Speaking of which, quick wristwatch check. I forgot to do it. Sorry, Malcolm. I'm wearing my JLC Reverso today. Beautiful watch. This watch is actually in white gold. It's a dual face, gray on one side with Dauphine hands, and then on the flip, we've got salmon with sword hands. I love this watch. I wear it all the time. This is the watch that I generally wear to meetings, actually, because I love it and I feel comfortable in it. I feel confident in it. But it's not super loud and it's not ostentatious, so I don't think I'm sending the wrong message, right? I won't be wearing a day date necessarily in a meeting too often. I won't be wearing Santos Carré in yellow gold or those sorts of things. I like to be a little bit more conservative, which I can imagine can be a little bit hard for maybe some of our YouTube people to understand, because we give you guys a little bit more of a behind the scenes look. But this is definitely, if I have a work watch, this is probably my work watch, right, in meetings. So back to the conversation. In light of the Cubitus release, I wanted to look for things like this, look for sports watches that actually represent, that give us a more complete understanding of that $40,000 price point in Patek Philippe. In the sports watch world, there are watches in the 30s that Patek does in complications, annual calendars, that are amazing. But in the sports watch world, there is one reference, and it's a 3800. The 3800 came in a multitude of different variations. Stainless steel, yellow gold, two-tone. There were over 20 dial variations, which is crazy and hard to believe. There were white dials, which didn't really exist in the 3700, the predecessor. There were champagne dials. There were blue dials, different color blue dials. There were so many different dials, diamond dials, so many dials. Okay, it was an era of, in a way, kind of customization or personalization. We saw that in many brands. We saw it in Piaget as well, right? At the time, the wealthy demanded a level of kind of catering that they don't really demand today, or aren't able to demand today in the watch world. Now it's the ultra wealthy that submit applications for custom pieces. Back then, it wasn't abnormal for a Patek Philippe customer to demand something really different. Today, you need, a couple $1 million in diamond spend history and God knows how many ladies' Pateks to justify an allocation for like a custom or really special piece, right? It's a different era. So what's beautiful about this piece I found here? So at $44,473, I don't necessarily think that this is the price it ought to be. I think it's a couple $1,000s expensive. I do think it's a little expensive. The condition is great. This watch has definitely been refinished. I don't mean that as a dirty word. I mean it as a totally acceptable thing to do in the world of vintage collectible watches. There's nothing wrong with maintenance so long as it's disclosed. You can tell because of the brushing you have here on the bezel, the fine defined lines you have around the bezel. If this watch was refinished by an amateur, someone that didn't belong near Patek Philippe, you would lose all of this. You would not have such a clean job. This was a professional, very good service or refinishing. The dial is very clean. Of course, it has the inclusion of the second hand. I don't love that. That's actually the thing I like the least about the reference 3800. Today's episode is sponsored by our friends over at Miracle Sheets, and no night for me would be complete without them because of their temperature regulating capabilities. They are inspired by actually NASA technology, and each Miracle Sheet is actually infused and woven with silver fabric. With silver infused fabrics. That's how they're able to manage a temperature regulating comfort, that cool sort of beautiful comfort. There's nothing I hate more than waking up in the middle of the night or feeling that kind of hot, somewhat sticky, humid feeling, be it in the summer or frankly even in the winter. Miracle Sheets avoid all of that. And because you're not sweating and kind of feeling uncomfortable, it always feels so clean. Because they're silver infused, they're actually able to mitigate the growth of bacteria. It's an amazing technology. I love Miracle Sheets. I couldn't recommend them possibly more to you if you value your sleep. So if you do, go ahead on over to trymiracle.com/Theo, not only for yourself, maybe as a gift. I couldn't recommend it more. And if you order today, you can save up to 40% on that order, making the already amazing offer even better. Head on over to trymiracle.com/Theo. Thank you to Miracle Sheets. But I do love the size. At 37.5 millimeters, I believe. It's a beautiful sized watch. I think it's great. I like two-tone as well. I'm kind of a sucker for two-tone. I understand why this watch is not for everyone. It's not the quintessential sports watch. Again, at 37.5 millimeters, it's not 45, which the new Cubitus is. And I think that that's certainly too large. I think that's the consensus online as well, or as close to a consensus as can come. That's the prevailing opinion, maybe. But I can also see someone being, I would have to be fair to someone that said that this was too small, right? Understanding that the Nautilus collection is generally 41 or 42 or perfect in that world. I can see someone saying that 37.5 is small. I think that they would be fair to say that. I still do think that this is, or know that this is, a really well executed watch. This is essentially it's nearly a perfect watch. It is a very early reference. This particular watch dates to 1992, which is, about maybe it's 10 years or 11 years after the reference is introduced. But it's a great piece, right? Obviously, when you're buying online, I'm not recommending you do this, but if you were, you need to take in consideration servicing and authenticity. I'm making no recommendations. I'm not putting a stamp of approval on this watch. I'm just using the Museum of Unsold Watches as a reference point. Apparently, this watch comes with its original box, which I think is really neat. If it didn't, you could probably source a box as well. It's not the end of the world. But long story short, this is a great piece. Before I move into these other two watches that I want to briefly mention here, I hope that you are enjoying this sort of content. If you're enjoying this first of the 3 segments we'll be doing, please comment down below. This is the sort of content that we do much more so over on the Zero, which is our private podcast community. You can sign up down below. We've had a ton of people sign up, and it's a great community where we release the sort of content that's more behind the scenes. It's more diverse content. We do a lot more about clothing, a lot more about style, a lot more about watch buying, and I can give you some more opinions. Recently, we did an episode over there where I showed a major problem I found with a GMT that's available on Chrono24. The Zero is an amazing place. It's only getting better. It's not free. It's $10 a month, but you get enough credit to the Theo and Harris shop where you get free straps and all these different things. So it really comes out to be a bit of a wash in the end. Anyway, go ahead and join the Zero if you haven't already. If you had joined the Zero and maybe paused, come back, take a look at some of the new content we're making. It's fantastic. Looking forward to seeing you all over there. It's a big part of this whole Theo and Harris community with some amazing content. So moving back into this conversation, this is where I think $40,000 is better spent. Now, so far as an investment, the Cubitus at $41,000 will immediately be worth maybe double. So I get it. I get it. I'm not encouraging people to be selling their allocations. I don't really like that. I don't really like that consumer behavior. That being said, I do think when all the dust settles, in the end of the day, when we go back 10, 15, 20 years from now, these are the watches that will be collectible. This is the sort of watch that will have done better in the market for longer. I think your money's actually safer in the long run with a 3800, particularly a 3800 in good condition like this, than with the Cubitus, which that watch just, I'm sorry, it made no sense to me. My thoughts are over on the Zero in longer form. But moving on to our next 2 watches here, which I'll do a little bit, more quickly, a little bit more brevity here. This next piece is a Rolex GMT Master Reference 6542, and this watch brings up 2 interesting points, okay? First, a little bit of background. 6542 was the first reference of Rolex GMT Master. It was the reference that was featured in James Bond with Pussy Galore, right, as the female, love interest, right? The watch was the reference that the technology, the GMT technology was introduced. That was technology that was pioneered by Rolex in collaboration with Pan American Airlines. The design language of the piece wasn't very dissimilar from the Submariner, right, which was released 2 or 3 years earlier. But this addition of this blue and red Pepsi bezel was just iconic, and it clearly has lasted until today, right? It's one of the most desirable watches in the world, the Rolex Pepsi. Now, this particular watch brings up 2 really interesting questions. Now, I think it brings up more than that, but let's just start off with 2, and let's focus in there. Number 1, case condition. This watch, again, it dates to 1958. No original box, no original papers. I do not question the authenticity of this watch at all. I'm also not standing behind it. I'm just looking at 2 things here, and I want to discuss them. Number 1, the case condition. This watch does not have the defined lines that we look for in vintage sports models. That's true. A vintage or a proper 6542, just like a proper vintage Submariner, has what's called beveled lugs, which means the lugs essentially have a top and a side, but also this, this other facet that actually gets wider toward the bottom that splits top and side. Right, the Rolexes no longer have those bevels. Tudors do, believe it or not, right? Tudor carries on that tradition, but Rolexes don't. This watch doesn't have that. So now here comes the question. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, we can definitely acknowledge that a watch without bevels is not as good as a watch with original bevels. But do all watches with bevels have original bevels? Or are there aftermarket bevels? Or is there technology that enables watch owners to recut their watches? Yes, absolutely. Now that opens up 2 new doors. Is that okay, right? That's the question. Well, number 1, of course it's okay if it's disclosed. There's nothing wrong with refinishing. I brought that up with the Patek Philippe just before, right? Nothing wrong with having professional work done to a watch that restores its shape and restores its finishes. Nothing wrong with that. But what if it's not disclosed? Now it's misleading. It doesn't become counterfeit per se, but it certainly becomes maliciously, deceptively tampered with, something you'd want to stay away from. Whereas this watch, while not perfect, right, clearly there are no bevels, it's not a great condition case, it's honest. It's honest. You know that the seller is not trying to fake anything to you. They're selling you an honest watch. So the question is, how do you feel about that? I personally would prefer a watch with bevels, but I am comforted by the fact that the seller is not pulling any tricks, at least seemingly. Now, the second question I have here is, or rather comes about if you look more closely at the bezel. The Rolex Bakelite bezel, Bakelite was an early type of plastic here, the original type of material that the Pepsi bezels was fashioned in, right? After Bakelite, we went to aluminum. After aluminum, we went to basically Cerachrome or ceramic, Rolex's proprietary ceramic. If you zoom in, you can see that this bezel has been cracked and reassembled. Well, first of all, is that normal? Yes, that's absolutely normal, both the cracking and the reassembling. Bakelite bezels, Bakelite as a material, is, relatively speaking, very fragile for sports watches. That's why they don't use it anymore. It is not a reliable material. But what about the reassembly? First of all, I don't even know how they reassemble this, because that in and of itself must be an incredibly difficult, task. Why do it? Well, at the end of the day, the bezel, even if cracked, when reassembled, is or has a bit of value, even if it's $5,000 or $10,000. 10 may be on the high end, but even if it's around $5,000, all cracked and reassembled, that's worth doing, right? Or that's worth having done. Now, it's certainly not as good as a bezel that wasn't cracked, but a bezel that wasn't cracked is going to cost you a multiple of that. So the question is, how do you feel about a Rolex Bakelite GMT of 6542 with that cracked but reassembled bezel and the soft, right, meaning without bevels case? I personally feel it's kind of cool that they're not lying. I think it's kind of, I think it's honest, and I think that they're delivering an honest watch, an honest, imperfect watch. That's it. That is my opinion. I don't have an opinion on price. I won't make a statement there. I think I've given the watch enough, enough light here, right? But I think that the piece's existence did bring about those two interesting questions, and I'd love your opinions down below. The last watch we'll talk about today before we move on is this. A Rolex, reference 1803 from 1959. Now, this is what you call a transitional Rolex, okay, a transitional reference. This is an extremely early reference 1803 because it looks a heck of a lot like the preceding reference or references, because we've got these alpha hands, we've got this kind of flatter dial, we've got these little notes here that remind us of, well, because they are characteristics of the 1950s as opposed to the 1803, which really became more mass produced in the 60s and 70s. Now, okay, well, what are the questions that this brings about? Well, number one, the value add here is obvious, right? The detailing is special. The hour markers are not stick, they're not wide boy, they are sort of daggers. That is rare and interesting, I think. I think it's beautiful, but it's certainly rare. That's a good thing. And the matching, quote-unquote, alpha hands are quite lovely as well. So if you're in the Rolex game and you want to look at something that is unusual and collectible, maybe has upward mobility so far as value, this is a good place to go. Now, the problem, right, the drawback that balances out the equation that makes it an interesting subject is, well, what about servicing? Because this reference, again, transitional, may be much harder to find parts for. Rolexes are notoriously easy to service, relatively speaking, to a lot of other brands like Patek Philippe, let's say, or Vacheron Constantin. But once you go into the 1950s, you're opening up a whole new can of worms with service. And that's why even though I adore little details on Rolexes, specifically gold Rolexes, I have to say that I would probably recommend people stay away from those 50s watches unless you really have a tolerance for risk and for nuisance if something goes wrong, and opt for things from the 60s and 70s and 80s because they'll be so much easier to remedy if there is ever a problem. This has been a fun episode. I'm glad to be home. I'm glad to be creating cool content. I hope that you all liked it. Comment down below. Go take a look at our private podcast community over at The Zero. We're releasing more content like this and all sorts of really behind-the-scenes Theo and Harris content that we're excited to make and share. So go ahead over there, shoot me a message, and that's it. Have a beautiful day, everybody. Bye-bye.